Hi everybody, welcome to the What Does the Data Show You show. What does the data tell you show? There we go. Bit of a mix up at the start, but we'll carry on. But look, welcome. This is my Wednesday show, which we do every other Wednesday, talking about data, and then every other time that we do it, we talk about sort of the midweek marketing mix and what's going on, what's new and exciting. But this is specifically data orientated, and our aim of this show is to give you the story of the data. There's a lot of my belief in social media that we do an awful lot of stuff. All right, we put a lot of information out there, but unless we're measuring it, you can't manage what you're doing. And that's really very important for me. And so the aim of this show is purely to bring you the best social media analytics programs out there, bring on the guys that matter, talk about relevant case studies that you can then use and hopefully apply the tools and techniques learned here into your own marketing analysis for your clients. And so without further ado, let me introduce Charlie and Fran from Pulsar, Pulsar platform. And hey guys, why don't you introduce yourselves and talk about Pulsar as a platform and give us a little bit more information.
So my name's Charlie Marr, and I work in the Pulsar product team alongside Fran. I actually work more on the client-facing side of things, selling the product in to various users. And I will hand you over to Francesco, who is our VP of Product.
Hi, I'm Francesco, and I work on the product team. My responsibility is to design the product and carry on any experiments with the data that might lead us to develop new interesting ways of using the data and pilot new techniques for using social data in the kind of like broader marketing mix.
Cheers, guys. And you mentioned there, Charlie, sorry, no, Fran, you mentioned it about the point of experimentation. One of my big beliefs on this, and when some of the clients that we work with start getting involved with data analytics and they go, oh, this is fantastic, so we can test. And they sort of think it's a bit of a blunt instrument, which is it's a single test. And one of the things that we always try and instill with these guys is saying, no, there's one test and then you continue to test and you continue and you continue and you continue. And arguably social media, in my mind, is as much about the marketing as it is about the experimentation with the marketing that you're doing. Would you guys sort of agree with that? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, totally. I mean, social media is a moving beast, and when I started working with this kind of data, I was like 1999 more or less, and there was no Facebook, no Twitter, no social networks that were like the scale of what we have today. So social media meant a completely different thing at the time. But even with Facebook and the way we use social media, we went from, culturally speaking, people use social media in a different way. It started with the idea that people were doing live vlogging, so they were kind of like tracking what they do in real life, and they were kind of like sharing their life and this kind of like economy of sharing. But now what we're seeing more and more is that social media is more about a projection of who people are and kind of like something that helps people design and share their identity rather than something that allows them to live log their lives. This means that you have to look at different things in social media to be able to interpret it in the right way. And also another thing that is always constantly moving is not just the cultural fit of social media in society, it's also the technology or the media platform. They're constantly reshaping the experience, so you constantly have new opportunities and new ways of understanding human behavior using the data. So it's quite tough to be able to stay relevant in this market, but it's also interesting because it allows guys like us, for example, that didn't start 10 years ago designing a product like Pulsar to just come into the game and offer something new that some people might find relevant.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny you mentioned obviously the vast array of platforms out there. I mean, when I started back sort of 2005, 2006, I always talked about a triangular approach to social media and how that was used to drive traffic towards a blog at that time. And for me, it was purely then about Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter.
Yeah.
And now the vast array of social sites out there mean that I truly believe that people, clients, whomever it is, whether you're personal blogging yourself for your own interests, it is important that you realize the amplification of your posts and where they're being seen, or whether you're a brand who is looking to find which platform is more suited to the demographics that you are working with. And arguably, this is where the social media analytics world comes into, because every single platform's totally and utterly different. You could be sending a post, and interestingly, we saw some work on Tumblr last week with Coca-Cola. And they haven't been doing an awful lot on Tumblr, but the amount of reach and amplification through Tumblr meant that you could see a pattern that they were suddenly starting to use it as a platform an awful lot, which meant that they are obviously a brand which is listening to the analytics. And on that point, let's talk about Pulsar for a second. What platforms are you able to analyze?
Yeah, certainly. So as you said, James, there are a very diverse range of platforms, and they are popping up all the time. If you take out a subscription of Pulsar, we cover a wide range of social media platforms, blogs, forums, and news and review sites. So we're trying to give you a nice holistic coverage of the internet. In terms of the specific social media platforms, what we're tracking is Facebook, Twitter, Google+, Tumblr, YouTube, and then we're also picking up on conversations within Instagram, Vine, and Vimeo. So quite a nice wide coverage there.
Wow, that's vast, isn't it? Yeah, you're one of the few which I know that are sort of trying to pick up the whole Vimeo world, which is, in my opinion, is often missed out. It's just not really considered.
That's a new area also that we're opening up in terms of, I mean, one factor in the diversification is the different types of platforms, but there's also now a new factor in the diversification of the industry, which is the countries that get involved. So we just launched Sina Weibo on Pulsar. So you can track any conversations happening on Sina Weibo now. We are about to launch Ren and Tencent Weibo as well. So that there's a really strong coverage on China that is coming through, and that obviously poses some big challenges in terms of engineering and in terms of data analysis, because the whole industry is based on text mining, and text mining as a science is based on Western languages, whilst the Chinese language is obviously functioning in a completely different way, which means that we're having to rewrite some of the basic algorithms that we use to analyze the information. But coverage on a global scale is really important for us, because the clients that we have tend to be global multinationals like Unilever, and they tend to have a footprint that requires for any tool that works with them to be able to cover all these different markets in the same way. So we tend to have kind of like a platform agnostic solution, but to be able to do that, you need to make quite a lot of effort to try and unify platforms and universes that are completely different.
Just going back a step, because sadly the acoustics aren't brilliant. I mean, you mentioned there about the Chinese platforms that you're starting to analyze. Did you give specific examples of the sites that you're able to analyze? I mean, obviously the Chinese social media world is vast. We've looked a lot at Weibo and stuff like that. So what are the sites you're starting to be able to look at from a product analysis side? So
Pulsar already tracks Sina Weibo, which is the equivalent of Twitter in China. We are working on integrating Ren, which is the equivalent of Facebook. Youku, which is the equivalent of YouTube. And Tencent Weibo, which is more of a forum-like, kind of like social media platform that is quite essential in China as well. So, I mean, with these four platforms, we got a pretty extensive coverage of the Chinese market, but the other problem in China is that the fragmentation there in Asia is almost as big as the fragmentation that you have in Europe. So if you cover in China, great, but then you still have to be able to cover Thailand, Vietnam, all the different countries that are part of the Asian continent, and they're all different in terms of languages and challenges that they pose to the text mining model. So it's an interesting effort.
But I tell you what, the important thing about this, and even in this conversation already now, I know, playing around with some of the Chinese social media sites out there, that I mean, it's a minefield. I mean, I like to think that we know our way around Twitter and Facebook and so on and so forth. But knowing our way around the Chinese sites is very, very difficult. And so, again, bringing it back onto the social analytics and social data side, it's even more imperative that we're able to track what is going on, the amplification of everything, the messages, who they're reaching, how they're reaching, influencers, and so on and so forth. And so just moving on in a second, I just want to make a point that, I mean, I'm really pleased about that, and I definitely want to talk to you more about those sort of Chinese stuff that you're starting to analyze, because I think that's imperatively important for anybody, whether they be US or European or of orientation from the social media marketing that they are doing, to be able to understand how that message is being put out there is fundamentally important if you don't understand the platform as much as perhaps we do the more mainstay social sites out there. But look, this show is fundamentally about looking at case studies and looking at how Pulsar has run some studies on relevant sort of business use. So why don't we crack on into some of that stuff? What have you got for us, Charlie or Fran? What can you...
Yeah, definitely. I think before we talk to you about the actual specific case studies, what would be really interesting to just show you and for you guys to understand is how the platform actually works in terms of the methodologies that we're using, because I think it's the diversity of methodologies we offer that allow us to do quite a range of different case studies. Yeah. So if I just share my screen with you.
Lovely. And while you're doing that, what I'm just going to say is everybody in the Google Plus event page, there's been a problem bringing all your comments in. So Zahar, Coach G Moore, all of you guys, Eamon Jones, if you've got any questions, don't hesitate. Put it into the event stream. I'll bring it across. And by the way, while you're there, if you bought presents, I'm very happy. Zahra, thank you ever so much for that. That's really good. If you're on Twitter or if you're watching it on any of the sites where this video is posted, do use the hashtag #DataShow in Twitter. And I'll bring some questions in. So at any point, fire away some questions, and we'll bring them in. Go for it, Charlie.
Thanks, James. Is that screen coming through clearly for you guys?
No, it's not coming through yet. So I'm afraid it's not bringing up.
Oh.
There you're getting up. See if it brings through. So once that button, you should have a selection of desktops that you can pick from.
Yes, yeah, sorry, I just actually, bear with me 1 second. I seem to have successfully deleted the page that I was trying to bring
And
up.
by the way, while we're waiting for this to getting in, bearing in mind that all of us guys are here based in the UK, and at the moment it's probably the hottest day known to man. And having been on the trains in London today, it's absolutely sweltering. So you'll excuse the fact that I'm probably sweating uncontrollably. And I can see that you guys are based in Tottenham Court Road, right?
We are indeed, yes. We
not exactly cold.
Made the journey back on the Central Line from Holborn, which is only a couple of stops, but it is absolutely sweltering.
Never a nice thing to have experienced, I can tell you. Especially when on one of my ones, the trains didn't even work, the air conditioning didn't work. But
there we go. Is that coming through?
Yeah, there we go. So this is the Pulsar platform.
Certainly, yeah. So this is the search setup page on Pulsar, and I think this is really interesting because, as you know, with a lot of social media tools, they work based on one methodology, and that methodology is keywords. What we're trying to do is actually move away from that quite simple and straightforward way of analyzing conversations. And we're trying to look at demographic groups and also at pieces of content. And these three icons in front of us at the moment actually represent those three different searches that we can provide. So on the left-hand side, we've got topic searching in here, and that's much like you guys were discussing with Simply Measured last week. You'll put in the keywords that you're interested in, be it one keyword or a long, complex Boolean search string, and then bring back all the mentions of those keywords across the sites we were discussing earlier. So that's one thing we're offering. The second way the platform works, and I think this is really where it starts to get interesting, is in its ability to track a specific demographic group, and we call that an audience search. And we actually allow you to do that in a couple of ways, either tracking all of the followers of a specific Twitter handle, so what we might call brand advocates, or by using one of our predefined social panels. We've got groups of people that you can dip into at any time, and those include mothers, fathers, young professionals, millennials, tweens, and you can simply jump into those data sets and see what they're talking about at any given time. Or, very interestingly, what you can do is actually run a topic search around a category, let's say cars in the United Kingdom, and then you could use the advanced filtering within Pulsar to pull out those demographics based on their age, based on their gender and location, and also by information they tell us about themselves. So you might want to compare what students in Manchester are saying about Ford Fiestas to students in London talking about Ford Fiestas. Just obviously a very top-line example there. And then on the right-hand side here, we have content tracking. And this is all about monitoring pieces of digital content, so a URL, be that an Instagram photo or a press release or a YouTube video. You can monitor that piece of digital content and you can see exactly how that spreads and shares online. So imagine you guys are putting out content for a campaign, you've got a new product. You can see exactly what the communities that's traveling through, who the key influencers are within that data set. Really powerful information that I think is obviously made possible by the fact that we're not just tracking keywords here. Now, the reason I thought it was...
Just to ask a question, Charlie, sorry, from my perspective, I presume each of those are interrelated as well. So you could follow the content which picks up the keywords used and the influences of that content which has been distributed, and then actually move them within the subgroups of, then put them into an audience or put them into keywords to follow. Is that fair to say?
Exactly that. So often the way that it'll be used by clients is that they'll create a search around a category. For example, Beefeater Gin, what they'll do is they'll monitor all mentions of gin and all mentions of the different brands. They'll identify the most influential people driving these conversations and then lift them into an audience search. Then within that audience search, they'll identify the type of media that they engage with, which URLs they're sharing. And then they'll take those URLs to put them into a content search. And then you're covering the whole spectrum of social media interaction, be it from the keywords they're using, the people talking about it, and the content that they're sharing, offering you slightly different perspectives in, and hopefully different insights that you can then kind of go out and action.
Yeah, pretty powerful.
Well, on the audience side of things, one of the recent innovations that we've introduced is the ability to tap into a predefined audience. So, say you want to tap into maps, and you want a panel of, like, we have panels of 5,000 maps, for example, in the UK. We analyze any conversations within public conversations and content shared by maps in the UK. And this is done by using very basic machine learning algorithms to identify specific user profiles. We started with mums and dads in the UK and in the US, but we're expanding the types of audiences that we're offering, and we call these social panels. It's basically like offering traditional panel methodology for social media data, which is quite useful in terms of understanding specific segments of your audience. And some brands are starting to use this to tap into their own audience segments in real time. So they will come to us with a segmentation model, and they will tell us, these are the 5 segments that are part of our audience. We would like you to create for us 5 panels that are mirroring the segments that we have identified within our audience, and then give us a dashboard in Pulsar that allows us to see in real time what our audience is up to. What movies are they watching? What content do they like? What do they talk? What news articles do they share? What newspapers do they read, and stuff like that. So it's quite easy.
So it's sort of the market research, but using the demographics to be able to get that off. So any company that's looking to put an advertising campaign out there is saying, well, hang on a second, let's look at the associated worlds in which they're building and go from there. And I've actually just had a question in, and I think we're probably going to get to this, from Zara, who said, may we see some examples of coordinating, say, topic and audience. Are we going to boil into some details on this?
Yes, so I'm going to show you how you can use these audience trackers and how you can use the content trackers. On the content trackers, what's interesting is that brands are spending more and more, obviously, in paid media, in social media. So what we're working on now, which will be released in the next few months, is a solution for connecting the organic, the kind of like the so-called earned media activity in social media, and connecting that to your own channels and the paid media activity. So by connecting to the Twitter ads API and the Facebook ads API, we will be able to connect the activity that's happening that can be tracked by Pulsar Track, and see that reflected on your own channels and on the performance of specific pieces of content. What's interesting now is that the organic content in social media is starting to get more and more connected to the paid content. So, for example, what you show on a TV screen during a TV show. And this is something that we didn't see happening a lot before, but since it's happening more and more now, it's incredibly important to establish that connection between the paid media and the earned media. And it's really essential not to silo social media into a kind of like bottom-up organic marketing activity, and kind of like disconnected from the rest of the marketing spend. It's really important to bring back social data into the broader marketing ecosystem and the broader marketing plan, and see how that specific data is leveraging or amplifying the rest of the marketing activity. What we didn't like in most of the solutions that have been available in the industry for many years is the fact that they tend to silo social data into a social media channel kind of niche, but social media is pretty much spreadable across the rest of the different marketing channels, so it shouldn't be singled out as a silo. It should be integrated with the rest of the activity that you're doing. We want to provide marketers the ability to connect the marketing KPIs with social data, not isolate social data.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more, because basically, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, social data becomes a positive feedback loop, which is you put your advertising out there, you think you know where you are, and arguably going back to your first point, which is you look at the segments that you are trying to attract with your product.
Yeah.
You build your marketing plan around that. You then put your messages out in the vast array of different social sites, and then you can refine. And by refining using the analytics, you then readjust your message, you readjust your segments, and so on and so forth. And the journey keeps on coming, which comes back to the initial point, which is always use your analytics at all times. It's experiment, it's experiment, it's experiment. But I'm just going to bring up a question again, which brings back into what we were just talking about there from Zara's point about, let's see some examples of topic and audience. Eamon's brought in here, what features and traits can it segment an audience by?
So I'll show you an example on how we did it, for example, for Twitter, where maybe it's worth showing you directly.
Yeah, perfect. That'd be great.
We'll answer this question. Let me go to the slideshow that has.
And again, while you're bringing it up, Master Shane, thanks for your comment. He's just saying, looking forward to the ability to identify different segments of audiences and really understand them, which is fantastic. He says, thanks guys. Does Pulsar have a website? We'll bring that up at the end for you and Master Shane, no problem at all. And let me just blue box this so you can bring this up.
Yeah, we've got it. My screen already.
Perfect.
So this is a really good example of what we mean by doing audience segmentation by using social data. So this one is done exclusively on Twitter, because this was done for Twitter, and it's a study that we were asked to do for mapping the audiences of a bunch of TV programs, TV shows. So in this specific show, if you live in the UK, you're familiar with the show. This is Question Time, which is a talk show that addresses a bunch of different subjects that can go from, well, mostly politics and like public affairs, really. And every episode of the show tackles different kind of subjects. So one of the things that Twitter was interested into was understanding, first of all, how much is the activity on Twitter amplifying the reach of the TV show, and potentially the reach of the advertising that is broadcasted within the TV show, or the activity that is connected to the TV show in terms of brand activity. But they also wanted to understand what kind of people are watching the show, how do they change from show to show, and what is the connection between the subjects of the show and the types of people that the show attracts. So let's keep from the basic numbers in terms of like how many unique audience engage in this conversation around one episode of the TV show, what is the potential reach of that TV show, and let's go to this map, which is the really interesting bit. So the map that you see at the back of the screen is basically the entire...
One thing, sorry Frank, can you just do me a favor? Can you go to where it says 100% at the top, can you just increase that so we can see the small written details, if that's all right? And just actually while you're on this is particularly interesting because I've seen a distinct shift in Question Time in the last 6 months where they've got a massive panel of very, very hard-hitting political people that get involved. And there's been a real shift in the last 6 months to bringing on a more populist panel where you've got a special guest now who might be a footballer, they might be somebody in entertainment who's often outspoken. And I've always wondered, because they're often using hashtag Question Time all the time to promote the secondary scheme element of the television. And this is particularly apt now. So yeah, thanks, Fran. This is a great introduction.
So I'm glad that you mentioned that, because Question Time, compared to a bunch of other TV shows that we analyzed, is one of the shows that has the most vertical kind of engagement. So by vertical, I mean that is a type of engagement online in the second screen that is driven by the question time account, and that question time account is kind of like managing the flow of engagement online by forwarding questions, by connecting people that should be listening to the same argument, by integrating people in a debate that are possibly not watching the TV show but maybe they're online. So it's quite interesting because the question time account now works more and more as a hub of activity, and it connects a bunch of different people to it. And what Twitter wanted to know, and the BBC wanted to know as well, was what kind of communities are formed within the audience that is watching question time. So what we did in this case was analyzing the way, so it's segmenting this audience in terms of communities. So, and the assumption was that if we can understand the communities within the audience, we will probably get a really consistent profile of the different communities in terms of demographics. So what we did first was connecting any conversation mentioned in question time or any question time profile or hashtag while the show was live. Once we had all the data collected, we then analyzed the social connection between the people that were mentioned in the show. So if the three of us were mentioned in question time, we would be in this data set. Well, what I would do next would be for checking if you are following me or I am following Charlie. And by looking at these social connections, then what we were able to do was detecting communities. So if you have a really dense area of mutual social connections in terms of mutual following, that usually identifies a strong community network within the audience. So once we identify this community network, we were able to partition the audience. And the colors that you see here are basically identifying those communities. You can see pretty clearly 5 big clusters. There's a blue cluster, the fuchsia cluster, the orange cluster, the green cluster, and then there's a bunch of smaller ones, but there's a red one that is larger than others. But what we did next was analyzing the demographics of these clusters. And because Twitter does not provide clear demographic data, what we had to do was using Bayesian statistics to infer what the demographics of the audience was based on what people were mentioning, what they were saying in their bio, what their past Twitter activity was about, what location were they from. And we were able to identify, I'm extracting only a bunch of you can probably see some detail here, but it's just a very limited preview of what actually the study contains. You can get down to understanding the average age of that cluster. So if you look at the orange cluster on top, you have a 40 years old white British cluster, mostly made of manufacturing professionals, nurses and teachers. And this is great because this particular episode of the show that we were analyzing was about issues within the education sector and within the manufacturing sector. You can see where this cluster is from, so London, but also Manchester and Liverpool. And you can see what kind of subjects are they usually into: politics, tech news, environment, but also more mundane things like cooking and tennis.
Fran, would you mind if I just interrupt there for a second? Because I think I'm going to put it on the blue box so it stays on your screen, because I think it's very important. Because to me, immediately, and I'm bringing this back to the analytics perspective on this,
yeah.
And you mentioned then that this particular episode that you're analysing, and I'm presuming that anybody can do this using the platform of Pulsar. They can go in and they can search for the audience, and they can then segment it down into whatever they want to look for. But in this instance, because it was about education, I was a bit astounded, because just looking from an observer's perspective, so excuse me if I'm completely out of kilter here, but it looks like obviously the green cluster was a pretty big cluster. There was an awful lot of people there. And I'm looking at this and I'm saying, Christ. So question time on this at this time had a 28-year-old white British audience, which astounded me, who were into partying, reading, comedy, and football. And I'm thinking, Christ, that's not a question time audience.
Yeah.
And then suddenly, when you look into context and you say, well, hang on a second, what were we talking about on that show? And we were talking about education. So my argument then shifts a little bit and saying, well, actually, hang on a second, that's probably the reason why. And do you know where this episode was geographically as well?
I don't remember that, actually. That's a good question.
And the reason, just for the benefit of everybody watching who perhaps may not be British or maybe from around the world, question time every single week, it's a different city around the UK, or town for that matter. But the reason I say that is, again, because using analytics here, what you've got is a breakdown of a single episode of a single show but there is no reason why the hashtag, I suppose in this instance, hashtag question time, could not be utilized over a series of shows and broken down to say, well, hang on a second, what is our core audience? Because this is such a specific example, right? I mean, this is unique to that episode.
What is also interesting is that if you repeat this about a bunch of different episodes, what you can start seeing is patterns in terms of what people remain loyal to the show and what people are changing within the show and what percentage of people are kind of like constantly watching it and what percentage are just tuning in because the show is interesting to them because of the topics it mentions, the subjects he's discussing. And one of the things that I wanted to highlight is that when you do analytics in social media, because we're obviously we're not the NSA and we don't want to be the NSA, we have to infer and kind of like understand, and there's a lot of insight at work here. And what's interesting is that you can connect that insight and more solid analytics really easily. So if you look at, for example, the descriptions of the orange cluster and you compare that to the descriptions of the blue cluster, you can see that one is kind of like more of a left-wing kind of cluster and the other one is more of a kind of like conservative cluster. And if you then look at solid data like who are the most followed profile for each cluster, you realize immediately that there's a connection there. So the orange cluster, the most followed account is Ed Miliband. In the blue cluster, the most followed account is David Cameron. And that's, to me, like when I saw that, and when we did this initially, we weren't sure that the methodology would return really solid analytics on this audience. And when we see the data matching in such a strong way, we were really excited, actually.
And then again, and bringing in again the analytics and how we can use this. I mean, obviously we should be picking up on this sort of data and saying, well, hang on a second, are we attracting the right audience? If we're not, do we want to attract a different audience? And then obviously you cater your marketing accordingly. Because I mean, looking at the orange cluster and the blue cluster, the thing which strikes me is the fact that the blue cluster, 80% are male, whereas in the orange cluster, under 60% are male. So there's a real difference in demographic side there as well, but I'm very conscious. We're over halfway now, and if you've just joined us, this is the What Does the Data Tell You show. We're featuring the Pulsar platform in this, and just giving some examples of what these guys are up to and how they're using data analytics, and how you could potentially use their platform and get some stuff out of it. So what I wanted to do, guys, if you don't mind, have you got what other examples have you got that we can talk around, if you don't mind, to give the viewers the maximum sort of idea of what they could possibly get from your platform should they want to use it?
So another good example is mapping how content spreads online. So you put a bit of content out there, like it could be a video, it could be a news article, it could be a press release, it could be, I don't know, a song. What Pulsar allows you to do is to track how the content spreads by recognizing whenever that piece of content is included in a post on social media, specifically on Twitter, Tumblr, and Facebook. Once you can map this spread, the connection of this piece of content, what you can start laying down is the flow of this spread. You can see where it started from, where it went to. In this particular map that you're looking at, this is another project we did for Twitter that we're interested in studying how video spreads on their platform. This map that you see here is a map that shows how the video of Commander Hadfield, the astronaut from Canada, singing Space Oddity by David Bowie, spread on Twitter when he released it online. You might remember last year when Commander Hadfield, this Canadian astronaut, he was recorded a cover of Space Oddity by David Bowie from the International Space Station. The cover was then uploaded on YouTube, and then he tweeted a link to this YouTube video. And this is how that video spread online. What you can see clearly on this map, for example, is just one of the dimensions of the data. Is the color of the connections indicates the location of the people that are sharing this piece of content. So every dot that you see in the map is a person that has been posting their content, and every line that you see in the map is a retweet. So someone taking that piece of content from someone else and retweeting it and posting it on their timeline. The more retweets you generate, the larger your node is within the network. So you can see, for example, that the largest node in the green cluster that you see on the top is Commander Hadfield. The green for Canada, obviously, which is where the outbreak of the video started. But what you can see next is there's a larger cluster, the bottom right, which is blue. And that cluster is a British cluster. And as you can see, the top node in that British cluster is Dara O'Brien, the comedian. So
yeah, of course, yeah.
But it's interesting to see that there is not much of activity in the US here, because the initial connection was mostly to the astronaut and to the David Bowie song. So you have Canada and England involved, although this is something that could have spread up massively in the US as well. The US just started to pick up later, and it's the red nodes that you see there. But what's interesting is that, for example, in this visualization, you can see immediately that the geographic location does have an impact in the way things spread virtually, because the way people are connected in real life and the way the geography influences the cultural affinity does have a strong influence in the way information spreads online in the virtual sphere.
Would you mind, Fred, if I just bring this back into context in terms of how to use this sort of data in general analytics? And actually that next slide you were probably showing may do the same thing, which is one of the things that I often talk about, and it was a question that was brought up last week, which was, how do we start on social? And a lot of the time I say, find the influencers. Find the people that are amplifying content. Find the people that are influential in that space. Now, that last slide with Dara O'Brien, for example, in the UK, the reason he's got such amplification is because he's a great big space geek, and he loves this sort of stuff. So I presume your advice would be on using, for example, the platform that you have is find the influences using searches. Is that fair to say?
Well, I wouldn't even start from influencers. I would start from using social data not just for measuring the effects of something that you've done, but using social data for preparing your strategy for what you want to do next. So if you want to launch a piece of content in social media, don't just launch it and see what happens and measure it afterwards. Before you launch it, build a profile of the kind of audiences that you want to reach and map those audiences in social media and understand where that content has to be seeded in order for you to reach the kind of audience that you want to hit. So these maps that I'm showing here, for example, are 4 different maps that show how 4 different videos went viral. So the first thing that you notice by looking at these maps, again, blue nodes are people tweeting and yellow nodes are people retweeting. One of the first things that you learn immediately by looking at these maps is that these 5 different viral videos went viral in completely different ways. In other words, there isn't one single model for virality. You have different ways of content spreading online. Something can be extremely centralized, like in the bottom left corner with Command-R, or in other cases you can have an extremely fragmented kind of diffusion like you see in the bottom right corner or in the top left corner, which is actually a commercial by Dove. It's the Dove Real Beauty Sketches. If you follow any digital marketing kind of like case studies and adventures online, you probably might have heard of that case study. What's interesting is that understanding why things spread in a different way, why they spread through multiple communities, or why they spread through one actor that is responsible for diffusing them online. And one of the things that we discovered is that the reason why content spreads fast or slow, or the reason why it spreads in a really vertical way or in a really horizontal way, is because of the audience that it's trying to reach. Some audiences are really fragmented, some audiences are really compacted. So we looked at these 4 audiences of these 4 viral videos that spread, and we mapped the communities within those audiences. And we realized that in the videos that were spreading really fast, for example, the fragmentation of the audience was really small, so there were fewer communities, so it was easier for the video to spread through a bunch of different people on a global scale. With the audiences, with the videos that were spread really slowly, we realized that the audiences that they were trying to reach were really fragmented, so it took longer for that video to jump from one place to the other. So what you learn from this, if you do an audience analysis before you're actually publishing that content, is that if you are trying to reach an audience that is really fragmented because it's made of teenagers from New York, musicians from London, and marketing professionals from from France, and you're trying to collect them all in one single viral phenomenon that you want to instigate, then you need to invest a lot more on seeding. If you know that you're reaching an audience that is very compacted and is very consistent and uniform in terms of the communities within it, what you need to know is that that viral phenomena is going to explode really fast, so you need to invest less on seeding and more on community management. But if you do all this mapping up front, you can understand what is going to go where and where you need to put your investment and how to plan it for harnessing the viral phenomena as it's happening. And one of the key things that you might want to do is understand the reach of influencers and whether they have a global reach or a local reach. So the map that you're looking at now, for example, is a map of Gangnam Style and how it's spread in social media in 2012. What this map shows is obviously the nodes are the biggest influencers that have been sharing that content online, and the connections, the color of the connections identifies the country of the people that have been retweeting that content from the influencers. So what you can see, for example, clearly here is that Katy Perry and Britney Spears have got a pretty global reach because they've been retweeted by people from many different countries. But then you have exceptions to that rule. For example, Tom Cruise, which you can see in the bottom right corner. You probably can't see it because of the size of the screen, but if I try and magnify that a little bit, this is quite funny. It always amuses me to show it to people. Tom Cruise has only an American reach, and everybody that is retweeting Tom Cruise is in blue. So you need to know these kind of ins and outs in terms of how the network that you're trying to reach work and how people engage with the content. And you can only do it if you map these connections before and afterwards, and you can understand what the best strategy is for leveraging viral content.
Very interesting. Yeah, okay, I get it. You're talking about things which I hadn't originally thought of, which is an awful lot of a lot of what I'm talking about generally in the analytics shows that we do is as a campaign is going and as a campaign is finished and almost looking back and analysing. But obviously what you're doing so eloquently here is saying, but hang on a second, that is only half the story. Before any brand is going out there and doing a campaign, what they should be looking at is the communities that will potentially be spreading the message, the influencers that are potentially spreading the message, and planning your campaign even before you've started going. So I think that's a really, really important point. So thank you, Fran. This is good stuff.
I think the beauty of social data is that the audience is already there, so you don't have to wait for them to come together and react. The audience is already there, is already talking about stuff, so you can almost simulate what the audience is going to be, how the audience is going to be reacting to your content, and you can try and understand beforehand what is the best way for you to engage with them, because they're already there and they're already talking.
Very much so. And you touched upon the Gangnam Style videos, because that was something quite a lot of interest in the people beforehand about the Gangnam Style versus the Harlem Shake. And I don't know if we can, because again we've got about 15 minutes or so left. I mean, this is normally meant to be a half-hour show, but it generally always drags on because it's such an interesting topic when you start boiling down into the data. Have you got to conclude and have a look at some of the Harlem Shake versus Gangnam Style in terms of how that how the different campaigns were very, very different in the sense of how they spread? Have you got some of the figures that, or some of the data that I had a look at the other day?
I haven't got it in this specific deck because I only had the Tom Cruise influencers slide on it for Gangnam Style and Harlem Shake.
Okay.
But the main difference between Harlem Shake and Gangnam Style was, well, there were many differences. The first one was the shape of the meme was very different. Whilst Gangnam Style was top-down, so there was an original version of the meme, and that version got replicated a few times, but the replicas of the original meme never got to the level of fame of the main meme. With Harlem Shake, you have a meme that is pretty much bottom-up and is grassroots. It's growing based on the different communities that adopt that kind of meme. So in Gangnam Style, you have one author that is like a little bit like the astronaut Commander Hadfield that is dictating the way the memes spread. and people are picking it up and spreading it, but it's the same content that travels across different networks. On Harlem Shake, you have an appropriation mechanic where people are using the shape of the meme, but they're creating their own version of it, and they're spreading it within their own networks. So,
actually, Fran, while you're there, can you just come off the screen share for a second, because then we can hear you, we can look at you as you're talking through it as well.
Yes. Where is it?
There you go.
Right there? Yeah.
There you go. Yeah, sorry, carry on.
So the shape of the two memes was completely different, and what we discovered with Gangnam Style and Harlem Shake was what really started us off in studying these content diffusion patterns, because we realized that virality obviously takes completely different shapes, but they tend to happen across two models of diffusion: the spiker and the grower. The spiker is something that spreads really fast, but doesn't last very long, and the grower is something that kind of like takes longer to pick up, but then it lasts for a long time. And what's interesting is that these models are really connected to the different kind of communities that you're trying to involve. Usually a spiker is something that is spread by a community that is quite compact and is quite consistent in terms of demographic, while the grower is something that has a wider demographic appeal, and it takes longer to spread because it takes longer to translate from one community to the other. What's interesting is that the Harlem Shake as a cultural form was, if you like, a series of multiple spikes, because the versions of the meme were so specific to the different communities that they were created for. I don't know, the Google team, the Miami Heat team. So they were all very specific audiences. So the reason why the Harlem Shake didn't last as long as Gangnam Style was that the Harlem Shake was all made of multiple versions of the same meme, but all very focused at specific communities. So it spread really fast within their niche, but it burned its fuel really fast and disappeared in the space of a month, while Gangnam Style went on for almost 12 months. And obviously the types of influencers and that global reach is obviously a testament to that. The kind of like wide appeal of that piece of content was obviously attracting multiple communities of people and multiple networks that made it stay alive for almost like 10 times the Harlem Shake.
I think there's a point there as well to be made, and this is linking back to Fran's comment earlier about integrating your analytics with your media spend in that wider marketing ecosystem. Is a video like Gangnam Style obviously had a very big budget behind it, making it proliferate not just online but also on music channels, on television, on adverts that you saw at bus stops, and that constantly keeps reminding social media users of this video. So they're going to be like, oh, that's cool, I'll retweet that to a friend or I'll share that on Facebook, therefore keeping that life cycle longer. Whereas obviously once that very community-specific Harlem Shake video has been shared several times, it's not going to then regenerate later on down the line, because there's no way of having that promoted or re-promoted rather to that social media community.
Yeah, I've got you. So it can't regenerate itself. It's burnt out on the first go, isn't it, really? But for those of you who are watching this, again, on the Google Plus event page, I've just put the case study that Charlie and Fran have been talking about here, the Gangnam Style versus Harlem Shake, which has got some of the figures which sadly we are not going to have time to go into. But it shows you some great ways to use the platform and get out what you want to do with it, really. But look, Charlie, Fran, I mean, we got 10 minutes ago. We probably haven't got enough time to go into an awful lot more detail in terms of what you guys can do in terms of case study stuff. But I just want to say, and Zara's just mentioned here, I like the pre-thinking concept, which is very useful for refining content, which I think she's absolutely right. It's something that every single marketeer should do, which is not just have a wonderful idea. They've got to have the wonderful idea, apply it, look at who it's going to go to as an audience. It's just like old school stuff, isn't it? I mean, it's like when we used to go and bid on television rights and which TV channel should we go to. We wanted to know exactly the reach of that television show, whether it was a newspaper article. We wanted to have a look at the reach of the newspaper article. Where did it go to? Where does it spread geographically? Which demographics watch that TV, radio show, or newspaper article? I mean, ultimately, what you guys have discussed here is absolutely fundamentally no different to old school media, but just bringing it into the 21st century, right? I mean, there's no...
That's why we're fighting nails and teeth to try and bring social media back into the marketing mix rather than outside of it as a specific department. And I think that's what's happening anyway, regardless of what we do. It's becoming more and more intertwined with the rest of the ad spend, and that's really important.
Absolutely. Well, I tell you what I always try to do at the end of this analytics show is always just put it to the guests and say, look, and I'm going to give both of you an opportunity here to put you on the spot. What is your #1 tip for social media marketeers, digital marketeers, to get out of social media analytics? What is the one tip that you would give them?
I'm going to start with a really basic one that sometimes people forget, but it's very simple. It's benchmarks, context. Get the context to your data. Whatever context you need. It can be external data, it can be what competitors are doing, it can be what the average of the people on the channel do, but get some context to your data, because that's the only way to analyze it. And so one of the things that I'm working on now is integrating Google Analytics data into Pulsar. So when you get numbers for your organic mentions and activities around an hashtag, you can see what kind of conversions rate you're getting for people going to your website. So that gives me an understanding of what that data is telling me and whether it's working or not. If I don't have that data, like absolute numbers are never going to be useful. It's just, I'm never going to be able to say anything about it. I can see what the trend looks like and how things are evolving, but again, that is bringing back social media into the silo. So context is the most important thing. Trying to match social data with any external data sets or with any benchmarks that you might have. And the second point I want to stress again is to use social media not just for measuring ex post, but for planning. That would be my key point.
Sure. And just to bring on a mention on that about the word context, in every show that I do on a Wednesday at 5 o'clock, whether it be the midweek marketing mix or the data analytics show, without fail, the one word which comes up at the moment, without fail, is context. Every single week, because whether or not, and it comes back down to segmenting data sets and everything like that as well, is unless you're giving context to the clients that you're sending your marketing to, they're not going to be interested. And unless, as you put it so beautifully there, Fran, which is unless you have context to the results that you're looking at, it's a waste of your time. All you've got is a trend of your data. I mean, okay, over time it'll give you a great idea of what's going on, but if you've got nothing to benchmark it against to show where you've come from or where you're going to, or you've got no aims to say, well, we are here now, we want to be here now, where are we in the middle of all of that? It's just not worth the time or your time to put all this energy into it all.
I've actually got it. Sorry, just a quick example on that. Like a big American network, NBC, asked us to do a study a while ago on measuring the social ROI of their online audience. They wanted to see how their online audience was performing in terms of amplifying the TV activity, because then they wanted to be able to go to their advertisers and say, our online audience is very strong, it generates this amount of engagement online, and this is how it stacks up compared to the audience of the other networks. So we analyzed the audiences online in social media of 15 different networks in the US, and then we were able to benchmark how these different TV audiences from the different networks are generating awareness around which brands, what is over-indexing within those audiences, how do they compare to the different audiences of the different TV channels. So that's gold for an advertiser. This is the first time that we can actually go and measure a real audience in real time and go and use that data for informing the marketing spend of people that want to advertise.
Certainly. And for me to answer that question, and this is kind of moving forward slightly from Fran's point, so similar in a couple of ways, is I think what people need to do when they're using these very sophisticated pieces of software is they need to actually set out with a list of objectives of what they want to achieve through the use of that platform. I think sometimes, certainly from conversations I've had in the past, people expect to be able to pump in a set of keywords and get the answers kind of almost magically presented in front of them. Whereas that isn't the case with these tools. They can certainly point you in the right direction and give you some key performance indicators. But you need to really sit down at the outset, and this especially applies with the kind of audience and content tracking, which are very new to the game. You need to sit down and think, right, this is what I want to achieve. this is how I'm going to go about achieving that. And then you can apply that methodology on the search. And there's one other thing I'd like to say, and this was just from a conversation I was having earlier that I found very interesting. Pulsar is obviously very much geared towards identifying influencers, and the way that we do that is trying to move away from clout score or moz score or number of reactions. And Francesco and his team have actually developed what's called a visibility metric, which is a proprietary algorithm that factors in the channel, the audience, and the engagement of every piece of content. So it's a very topical and constantly evolving metric. But why that's interesting and why I'm sharing this with you is that one of our clients is Hobgoblin Beer, which is an ale that you may well be familiar with.
Oh, yes.
And they identify at the end of each month the most influential users of their hashtags using our visibility metric. And it just made me chuckle the way that they then interact with those influencers, because that's the next question, isn't it? It's great, we know who these people are, but how do we utilize them? They actually direct message them, approach them, and offer them a free t-shirt and a 6-pack of Hobgoblin Ale, and they label them their Hobgoblins, which I thought was just great.
Well, I'll tell you what, your timing couldn't be more perfect, because at precisely 8 o'clock this evening, I'm actually going to be sitting in my local pub, drinking ale on a live Hangout on air with America, with Mia Voss and Chef Dennis Litley and Craig Fifield talking about real ale and beer and food, because Chef is a wonderful chef, as you probably imagine. So I might try and find some Hobgoblin and use the hashtag Hobgoblin in the whole process. But look, one of the things I wanted to pick up on to sort of give you my best tip on all of this from these guys is don't be afraid to play. You know, there's platforms out there which you need to be aware of, which is why I've got these guys on board. But play, get used to the platforms. And what Charlie has said there about getting your objectives in place, I cannot argue with that. That is such a bit of valuable advice about using social media metrics, social media analytics, is have an objective there. What do you want to get out of it? But in order to sometimes, I'm afraid to say, at the start of your journey with social media analytics, you've got to understand what you're doing. So use platforms like Pulsar here, have a play around with them, get used to the sorts of data you can get out of it, because trust me, sometimes the data is so overwhelming, you have to have a lie down, you have to sit down, you have to digest it all before you can understand those objectives which you want to get out of things. So have a play with these sorts of platforms, get used to using them, get used to the data that you can get out of it, and then readjust and say, right, what do I now I know what I can get, what do I want to achieve? How am I going to measure this? Use, as Fran said, get some benchmarks in place already. Set your objectives and then constantly measure and reflect back to see where you've gone and where you're going to. The most important bit. Now, final thing, we're going to close up. Guys, tell us more about Pulsar. How can they find you? Tell us prices. Give us a little bit of information.
Certainly. So I think, guys, if you want more information on Pulsar, where you need to go is www.pulsarplatform.com. That's our website. You'll be able to see more details of the various capabilities of the platform, as well as some use case studies. Obviously, feel free to contact us directly. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, that our email addresses are provided on here. Is that right?
No, they're not. No, but I can put them in the event stream afterwards if you like.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, that would be great if you could put myself and Francesco. Then you can approach us with any questions. In terms of pricing, would you like me to touch on that very briefly?
Yeah, please do. Yeah, absolutely. Perfect time.
So we have 2 pricing models for the product. One is based on a price per mention structure. And within that model, we don't limit the number of searches you can run or the number of user access logins you have. It's simply charged by the amount of data that you're populating the platform with. And the second model is an unlimited data structure, whereby you are limited by the number of searches you can run at any one time. Therefore, you have, for example, 10 live searches, and if you want to put a new search in its place, you simply pause one of those live searches and upload a new search. And we're not going to delete those paused searches for you, so they're there with all of their data and their search setup terms to reactivate at any time.
Good stuff. Fantastic. And look, basically, if they want to know more, they can come to you. I'll put the email in the system so they can come directly to you and go from there. But look, on that note, I'm going to have to finish it there. It's just gone over the hour mark, and I'm just going to finish it off with that famous quote from Peter Drucker, which I always use here, which is, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And that goes for many, many different things, from marketing through to management. So please always consider that. So my thanks to Charlie and Fran here from Pulsar. It's a great platform. I've had a little play around with it. Highly, highly recommend it. And if you've got any questions, always come back to me if you need to, or Charlie and Fran's emails will be in the event stream, so we can go from there. But thanks, guys. Cheers for your help, and I'll be signing off. Oh, before I forget, next week, Midweek Marketing Mix, fantastic panel. We've got Mike Alton talking about his book on Hootsuite. We've got Sarah Hill, 2.7 million Google Plus followers, talking about her experiences with Hangouts on air and how she's an Emmy Award-winning broadcaster off the back of it. Crikey, who else have we got? We've got Christine DeGaff talking about Google Plus, and we've got another couple of guests as well. But that's all happening this time next week, 5 o'clock. So I hope to see you there. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Cheers, guys.
Cheers, guys. Thanks, James.
No worries.